The Space Marines are the elite core of biologically engineered shock troops that present the strongest line of the Imperium's defense against their many enemies. On the tabletop, they field small cadres of highly trained troops, equipped with cutting-edge weapons technology and tactics. And today, we're going to be diving into the faction to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the army, their most powerful units, abilities, and the many ways they can be played. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about Space Marines. And as always, I do have a couple caveats for this video. First off, at time of recording, we are under the auspices of the January 2024 data slate. In addition, we're going to be covering the Space Marine Codex proper. I'm not going to be talking about any of the additional supplemental materials. There are a lot of additional chapters that you can play that are not within the Space Marine Codex, and I'm not going to be talking about those today. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of the faction, its strengths and weaknesses and special abilities. I'm going to talk about some specific units you should keep your eyes on, in particular, that are powerhouses of the faction. This is going to be a little tough for Space Marines because they have such a deep bench of units. They have so many playable options in their codex, but what I might do is talk about some kind of unit archetypes and examples of those within the faction. And then we're going to dive into each of the detachments. I'll give a brief review of them, some notable combos that you can include in your armies, as well as discussing how those detachments should play and their relative power level. In addition, I'm going to be using footage from my own games played online with the army and with these various detachments, as well as footage from live events that I've covered on this channel. If you want to see the recordings of these games, you can find them on youtube.com/TacticalTortoiseTV, or in the case of in-person coverage, you can find them on the live tab of this channel. And with that, let's dive in. Space Marines are a relatively elite army. They tend to bring low model count units to the table, but those units have above average stats. The army is supported by its faction ability, Oaths of Moment. This allows you as a Space Marine player to choose in your command phase one unit in your opponent's army. Importantly, this doesn't actually have to be a unit on the battlefield, and when you can't choose units in transports because they can't be affected by anything, they're in their own weird void, you can choose units that are in reserve or otherwise off the battlefield for whatever reason. This is important for units that are coming in on reserve so that you can get rerolls against them if attacking them in your opponent's turn. But generally speaking, you want to be choosing a unit that you particularly want to blow up that turn. The effective Oaths of Moment gives your army full hit rerolls against that unit. After you roll a hit, you get the option to pick up any of those dice and roll them again. Typically, this means you'll be rerolling misses, but it also interacts with a lot of combos that the faction has access to, where they get improved critical hits. For example, getting a critical hit on a roll of a 5+ to trigger abilities like lethal hits or sustained hits. Once that unit is destroyed, if it had attached units within it, so for example, a unit with one or more attached characters inside it, the Oaths of Moment, being a persistent effect, will carry over to any of those resulting splits. This isn't the case for transports, those are separate units, but it is the case for characters with the leader ability, as I mentioned before. So let's say you have two units attached to something like an Imperial Guardsman squad. Once you destroy that Guardsman squad, the two characters, maybe a Psyker and a Command squad, will also be affected by Oaths of Moment. So if you make subsequent attacks against those units, you'll be getting rerolls against both of them. Now, this ability supports the many strengths of the faction. It affects all of your attacks, both melee and ranged attacks, which means that the faction is highly flexible. It tends to have a pretty good breadth of both melee and ranged profiles, and with an incredibly deep bench, the largest selection of units to any faction in 40k, there are a lot of ways to play the faction. This is actually kind of a hard video to make because they don't have a very specific play style. Instead, they have the tactical flexibility to adapt themselves at the list building stage into basically any way that you want to play, which was a very intentional decision by the design team because they are basically one of the new player-oriented armies. And so being able to play into whatever playstyle you want makes them very flexible for new players who are just learning how to play 40k. On top of that, they also have good CP generation mechanics. There's a sub-theme within the faction of getting command points back or getting stratagems for free. You can see this in chapter master units like Martius Calgar or Azrael, who can generate you command points passively, or characters like the just regular Space Marine Captain, who gets you free stratagems, and Robuti Gilliman, who can get you even more free stratagems. The faction tends to use stratagems early and often. That can improve their survivability. They tend to be relatively resilient. While they're not the hardest faction in the game to kill, they do have good armor saves basically across the board, and with army-wide access to the Armor of Contempt stratagem, reducing opponent's armor penetration when attacking them on every single detachment that Space Marines have access to, you have to have very, very high armor penetration characteristics to get through them. Now, to be fair, they don't have too many invulnerable saves, especially on their heavier infantry or vehicle units, which can be problematic against high AP shooting, but otherwise they are relatively safe. Those elite units tend to be solid vehicles with above average stat lines. They are usually weighted between offensive and defensive stat lines, but tend to be fairly efficient, as well as elite infantry. Units like Aggressors, Terminators, and Centurions are heavy multi-wound infantry with high toughness and high saves characteristics, and are kind of a focal point of the army. That is complemented by their good access to utility units and objective scoring units. They have a lot of forward operators. Units like Scouts, Incursors, or Infiltrators are all good examples that, while not cheap, are relatively throwaway, and you can sacrifice them to score objectives, and they have a good access to a breadth of them. In addition, being an Imperial faction, they also have access to Agents of the Imperium, so they can get units like the Calidus Assassin to support their objective scoring abilities. Last but certainly not least, I mentioned before that they have a lot of synergies with Oaths of Moment and critical effects, and that tends to be kind of a theme of the faction. Several detachments have examples like that. We'll talk about those as we get to the detachments in specific. Now, that said, it's not all good for Space Marines. They do have a couple weaknesses. The first one is the fact that they are so flexible. They're just about the jack of all trades, master of one thing that their detachment tells them that they're good at. All of their units are relatively well weighted around speed, resilience, offense, and defense. They're kind of the dead average of units in 40k. And while they can be pushed into being very strong in one particular avenue or another by the characters you attach to them and the stratagems you use on them and the detachment that you're taking them in, they aren't good at everything all the time. An army focused on melee will tend to also be able to take average range, but their melee isn't quite as good as an army that would specifically be focused on melee entirely. They also have a relatively low model count, and while they tend to bring a lot of units with little 5 model units running around all over the place, those units are only 5 models and usually cost as much as 10 or 15 models in a faction with less expensive, more chaff units. That can make it difficult for Space Marines to steal objectives away from enemies, since they tend to be low objective control characteristic, even compared to other elite armies like Adeptus Custodes. That said, their game plan is usually about just murdering everyone on the objective, so that's not the biggest weakness in the world. And they also tend to be relatively slow. They have an average speed of 6 across basically all their infantry, their vehicles aren't particularly fast, and they don't have a huge access to repositional effects or teleports like some factions do. That can be supplemented in specific detachments like I mentioned before, but typically speaking, you will just be moving the normal 6 inches across the table with a lot of your army. Now, this is the part of the video where I would normally talk about the typical faction game plan for Space Marines, and it's very flexible. Basically, depending on the detachment and exactly how you built your list, they tend to change pretty significantly. That said, there is often a central theme with Space Marines. What they do want to do is kind of get around the fact that they're not super fast by putting pressure on their opponents with ranged attacks and with forward operating units. So you use units like Scouts and Infiltrators to score your objectives in the early game, as well as units like longer range guns like Gladiator Lancers to pressure your opponent if they allow you to draw line of sight to them but aren't necessarily coming out of cover. At some point, they'll have to move to the center of the table, and the Space Marines can punish them with their slower heavy infantry units. Depending on the detachment, that game plan could change, and we'll talk about exactly how that happens when we get to individual detachments. Now it's time to talk about some highlight units, and while there are going to be a couple units that I'll start with, there are also a couple unit archetypes that are included within the faction that have several different examples because the breadth of Space Marines is so high. First off, let's talk about the Aggressor Squad. These guys are kind of the premier heavy infantry for a Space Marine army. They have a very solid selection of ranged attacks, and while they're relatively short range, if you take the Bolt Storm variety, they're firing a twin-linked bolter and grenade launcher at 18 inches, which is good enough, especially since they can get access to several detachments to turning those weapons into assault weapons to allow them a good enough threat range that they can shoot at what they would need to. They also back that up with really good melee. They have a high strength, medium AP, medium damage weapon that is twin-linked, so they get wound rerolls just baked in, and they can typically combo that with Oaths of Moment to get hit rerolls as well, so they're getting both hits and wounds. A lot of detachments will have access to combos that are particularly strong with units with high volumes of attacks or on big, slow, heavy infantry bricks, and the Aggressor Squad tends to be the executor of those combos. The downside is that they are slow, and that can be rectified in some detachments or by using transports. The next unit I want to talk about is the Land Raider Redeemer. This guy is the premier transport and kind of a main battle tank for the Space Marine army. The Land Raider chassis is incredibly hard to kill. It's a 2+ base save with 16 wounds and access to Armor of Contempt and Smokescreen, defensive stratagems like I mentioned before that Space Marines make great use of. The Land Raider Redeemer is particularly dangerous for its insane torrent weapons. It has 2 D6 plus 3 shot, 2 damage ignore cover torrents with a high AP. This makes them a pretty solid threat against basically anything that's not like T12 or higher. Since you're going to be throwing enough auto-hitting dice at the problem to probably get a couple of wounds through even on higher toughness vehicles. The downside of the Redeemer's flamethrowers is that they are only a 12-inch range, and thank goodness for that, because not only are they good as an offensive powerhouse, but they can also be used in Overwatch on the opponent's turn, making them very difficult to play around for the other player. This is one of the premier units for Space Marines to take over the center of the table, force the opponent to come forward, and then be able to counterpunch with those big, slow, heavy units like aggressors. Now, speaking of aggressors, it can hold aggressors or other melee infantry. It has a pretty high transport capacity and the assault ramp ability, which allows it to disembark units and charge with them after it moves. And with a pretty decent movement characteristic of 12, it's able to get up to the center of the table, disgorge an incredibly dangerous unit of fighters, fire its flamestorms to clear out enemy screening infantry, and then allow those guys to charge in. It's really the full package. It's a unit that wants to get up close and personal to its enemies, has really good weapons to do so, a good defensive stat line to do so, and once it gets there, is able to disembark units that are very effective at close range as well. Kind of does everything. You'll find that depending on the detachment, a lot of Space Marine armies will include at least one Land Raider Redeemer to act as a central board holder or a bit of a counterpunch, and oftentimes will take more if they are a little bit more aggressively oriented. Now, speaking of aggression, let's talk about some utility units. The first one I want to talk about is Inceptors. Now, in the last data slate update, these guys were increased in points value, which was good because they were wildly efficient, and now they are a little bit more expensive, so they aren't seen as ubiquitously, but they are still a very important inclusion. Inceptors are an interesting profile. They can be taken in either 3-man or 6-man bricks. They have the same defensive stat line as the aggressor, being a toughness 6 heavy infantry, but they also have a jump pack, which makes them relatively fast at movement 10, and all their weapons are assault, which makes them good at advancing and shooting at whatever they need access to. While their weapons are relatively short ranged and don't shoot too many times, especially given the fact that the unit is usually only 3 models, they do have probably the best collection of weapon keywords of any ranged attack in 40k. Having both assault and twin linked on both their weapon profiles makes them good at getting access to the enemies they need to, and good at dealing with a wide variety of threats, because even higher toughness enemies can be taken down by a bunch of re-rolling wound rolls. Just like the aggressors, when they're comboed off with Oaths of Moment, they can be re-rolling their hit rolls and their wound rolls, which makes them very high reliability. On top of that, they're even flexible enough to be built to attack a variety of enemies. They can take their bolters if they want to be clearing out higher volume enemies. They're lower strength, AP, and damage than the plasma weapons, but fire more times and have the sustained 2 keyword. So a critical hit, usually on a 6+, will give them 2 additional hits, which you can then be rerolled on the wound roll thanks to their twin linked. Their plasma exterminators are also super high AP and high damage, as well as having a higher strength characteristic, so they're better against enemy heavy infantry, like enemy inceptors or aggressors, for example, or even enemy vehicles, being able to punch up into those higher toughness characteristics with that twin linked. So they're good at shooting basically anything you want, but they is also compounded by their meteoric descent special roll, which allows you to place them 3 inches away from enemies when deep striking them rather than the normal 9. The downside is that they can't charge afterwards, but that's not really that much of a downside because typically you don't necessarily need them to charge. Now, the reason that this is so important is that it allows you to access basically any area of the table that your opponent would normally be screening you out of. While it is possible to screen them out, it is incredibly hard. You can stop them from stealing objectives away by putting a 40mm base model on top of the objective marker of an objective, because then it's impossible for them to come in range of that objective. You can also just sort of surround the objective with a cloud of infantry, and that will prevent them from jumping on. However, it's hard to stop them from getting everywhere, and most armies don't have the model count to prevent them from coming in your deployment zone, for example, or in table quarters to score engage in all fronts, or places where they need to perform actions like deploy teleport homers. This makes them a superlative unit when it comes to completing tactical secondaries. Depending on what you draw, you basically always have the option to score that secondary with an Inceptor, since they can almost always be guaranteed that they can jump where you need them to. On top of that, they're also good at screening and blocking enemy units. You can use their ability to come in close by to enemies to jump them in front of enemy units where your other models might not have access, to prevent those units from moving forward. They'll probably kill the Inceptors, but you get around to shooting off, and you can protect the rest of your army. You can even use this in collaboration with rapid ingress to do that on the opponent's turn. If your opponent is moving up to try to get a cheeky charge into you, you can drop Inceptors directly in front of them to physically block their charge avenue. The amount of flexibility that Meteoric Descent gives the Inceptor unit, on top of having already good offensive stats, is what makes Inceptors so incredible. And while they aren't necessarily an auto-include in every Space Marine list, because they are relatively expensive, they are typically worth playing at least one unit of, because it makes your ability to score objectives so much easier. Now, scoring objectives can also be assisted by the faction's wide breadth of forward operator and utility units. These are units that are usually included in an army not for their damage output, but for their ability to do useful things, whether that's sitting on the back and holding an objective in the back because they're cheap, or standing in front of your opponent's army so to prevent them from moving, blocking off avenues for opponents to deep strike, or just simply starting in the middle of the table to complete a secondary on the first turn. Units like Scouts, Infiltrators, and to a lesser extent Incursors are all good examples of utility units, and the Space Marine Codex has a lot of these. Like I mentioned, Scouts, Infiltrators, and Incursors are some of them. Eliminators can also be included since they also have the ability to move after shooting, making them kind of very fast to get to areas of the table where they need to, and to a lesser extent you can also include Inceptors in this category as well. Most Space Marine lists will include 2 to 3 units of forward operators, whether those are Scouts or Infiltrators, and those give the army a great ability to stand in front of the table, prevent enemy Infiltrators from deploying near you, preventing enemy scout moves from getting in on you, completing secondaries on the first turn, and just generally being really useful. Scouts are an excellent example of this because of their guerrilla tactics ability as well. If they deploy aggressively and perform some actions, and then they are not needed in that position later on, they can use guerrilla tactics to enter reserve and then come in off of a table edge in the future. Infiltrators are also important here because they have their Omni Scramblers effect. While they're not as flexible as Scouts and they're significantly more expensive, they do prevent enemies from deep striking or coming in out of reserve within 12 inches of them. This prevents enemy units like Inceptors that could normally come in within 3 inches because the Omni Scrambler aura actually overrides whatever ability they would have to come in closer than normal. That means that they can protect your backline, your deployment zone, or your back objective. They can also be used aggressively forward to prevent aggressive enemies from deep striking on you or rapid ingressing in on the end of your own turn. They can also be made very difficult to interact with by attaching Phobos Librarians if you want to further increase their points value as well. Most Space Marine lists will include at least 1 unit of Infiltrators just to prevent units that can go into reserve and then come back out from performing actions or completing secondaries in the Space Marine deployment zone. Now, lastly, basically all Space Marine armies will have access to some amount of long-range anti-tank shooting. Space Marines have a lot of good examples of this style of shooting, so it's hard to pick just one. I think the classic example is the Gladiator Lancer. It's basically just a big gun on a repulsor field. It shoots a very high reliability laser destroyer that does crazy damage with a high AP and a bunch of baked-in rerolls. You can get rerolls for most of the moment, but its Aquiline Optics also gives it 1 reroll to hit, wound, and damage. That said, there are other options in the Codex. Predator Annihilators or Destructors give you pretty solid long-range shooting for very cheap, and while it's not as reliable as the Gladiator, it is significantly less expensive. The Repulsor Executioner gives you an even more impressive laser destroyer, as well as more anti-infantry shooting for more points, and you can also take the Ballistus Dreadnought, which is slower, but situationally harder to kill with a better save characteristic, and gets rerolls in the early game if your opponent's not too damaged. Taking 1 or 2 of these options in your list makes it much easier to deal with enemy long-range shooting, and it forces your opponent to take cover in the early game. Your opponent can't deploy their stuff out in the open and act willy-nilly if you're threatening 4 laser destroyer shots with effectively full rerolls against them that can potentially just knock them out on the first turn if they get too aggressive. Now, these units are basically good almost regardless of the detachment you're in, but they do get supercharged by some specific detachment abilities. So let's dive in and talk about detachment specifically. I'm going to be going through every detachment and some notable combos that you can include in your armies with that detachment, and I'll review the detachment briefly and talk about its relative strength. First off, let's cover the basic and most standard Space Marine detachment, the Gladius Task Force. Now, this was the detachment that was included in their original index release, and those detachments included in the index tended to be a solid encapsulation of the faction's themes, and this was perfect for Space Marines because the Gladius Task Force is probably the most flexible flexible set of detachment stratagems and abilities in all of 40k. You can build basically any variety of list out of a Gladius task force, and it will support it in some way. Were I to be starting Space Marines, I would probably start by playing around with the Gladius task force, because you can find abilities similar to it, but a little bit more focused in most of the other detachments. So you can decide which archetype that you want to play based on which of the doctrines within the Gladius task force that you enjoy. Now, speaking of doctrines, that is the detachment ability. You have selections of 3 doctrines, each of which you can choose during your command phase once per game to affect you for the remainder of that battle round. These are, in no particular order, the Assault Doctrine, which allows your entire army to advance and charge. Now, importantly, that doesn't also allow you to advance and shoot, so keep in mind that you could be advancing, and if you don't have the Assault keyword on your weapons, you won't be able to fire with that unit, but you will be able to charge later. What does allow you to advance and shoot is the next one, the Devastator Doctrine, and last but certainly not least, you can get yourself out of some sticky situations with the Tactical Doctrine, which allows your units to fall back out of melee, still operate normally, so they can shoot and charge after doing so. Now, these are incredible at improving the flexibility of your army, but they are only once per game abilities, unless you use the adaptive stratagem that is also included inside the detachment. This, in your command phase, allows you to select a doctrine for that unit that replaces any other doctrine and gives you access to that for a round. This means that you can continuously use buffs that would affect a unit during a certain doctrine being active, like Devastator or Assault, and allows you to have access to advancing and shooting or charging essentially any time that you need it. So if you need to buff your threat range, you can just pay a CP to put a unit into Assault Doctrine, even if the rest of the army is doing something else. This is what makes the army so flexible. You can increase your threat range at melee, shooting, or you can pull yourself out of combat at basically any time at all. Now, it is worth noting that Adaptive Strategy replaces any other doctrine that you would normally have active, so you can't use it to double up on doctrines. If you already have the Assault Doctrine active, for example, you can put yourself into Devastator, but you would lose the effect of Assault on that unit. Now, this means that most Gladius Task Force builds are very flexible. They include several units from each specialization so that you can make use of each individual doctrine to the best of its ability. And to do that, they have a wide variety of combos and stratagems in the detachment that can buff specific styles of combat. The most important one is the Fire Discipline combo. I actually have an entire video about this that I made back when it was called Bolter Discipline that I'll link here. You can see the sort of insane damage that this combo can produce, but it's an enhancement that allows you to improve the critical hits of your unit when you are in Devastator Doctrine. This means that any keyword that relies on critical hits is gonna get improved and working on a 5+ rather than just a 6. So if you can put together effects like lethal hits and sustained hits, both of those will trigger on that improved value. And once you're shooting at your Oaths of Moment target, you can reroll any hit roll that you want that is not a 5+ critical hit. So you can get enormous amounts of value from the combination of these abilities. This is usually attached to a character like an Apothecary Biologus or a Lieutenant, because they will grant you lethal hits, and then you can, because they can grant you lethal hits, and Fire Discipline grants you sustained hits at base. And once in Devastator Doctrine, whether calling the Combat Doctrine as normal or using Adaptive Strategy to put your unit in Devastator Doctrine, you can get all those buffs at the same time. The detachment also buffs ranged attacks using Storm of Fire, which can give you Ignore Cover and potentially +1 AP if you're in Devastator Doctrine, which makes it pretty good at shooting, as well as buffing melee units. You get the Advance and Charge from Assault Doctrine, and while affected by Assault Doctrine, you can use Honor the Chapter to get +1 to wound and +1 AP for your melee units. While Space Marine melee profiles tend to be kind of mid-strength and mid-AP, +1 to wound and +1 AP is such an effective buff that it puts basically any dedicated melee unit in the faction into the range of being pretty effective. So this allows you in the early game to select whatever combat doctrine you want to get the bonuses from, or that you need to get your units into range of the opponent. Then as the game becomes a scrum, use the tactical doctrine to extricate yourself from tough situations by falling back from enemy melee units that are trying to counterpunch you. And throughout the entire game, you have the flexibility of Adaptive Strategy to get whichever of those benefits that you want at any time, which is what makes the Gladius Task Force so incredibly flexible, and a pretty solid selection for a wide variety of Space Marine armies. As I said before, I think this is a good place to start if you are starting a Space Marine army, because it gives you total control over what your army can do at each turn and can buff a wide variety of playstyles. Now, unfortunately, some of the detachments that we're going to talk about next kind of live in the shadow of the Gladius task force. It's so flexible that it is good for a wide variety of different units and can buff them to even higher levels than more focused detachments. The first one that we'll talk about is the Anvil Siege Force. This is a detachment that focuses on heavy weapons. It gives all of your weapons the heavy keyword, which allows them access to +1 to hit if they remain stationary. Unfortunately, heavy is not a particularly great keyword. Units are not normally remaining stationary in 40k unless they're in a very good position. Because Warhammer 40k is an objective-oriented game, your units need to be moving to objectives or moving to complete tactical objectives in order for you to score victory points to actually win. And so being able to remain stationary is kind of a luxury that you won't often get to do. Now, if you already have heavy, the detachment also gives you +1 to wound, which is nice, and there are some combos that you can use with that to try to get some bonus benefits from it, but it tends to be difficult to unlock. Now, because of these effects, the detachment tends to be focused on artillery units, the units with the indirect fire characteristic, because those don't normally need to move to get line of sight to enemies to shoot at them. So you're getting a passive buff from the heavy keyword. Essentially, units like whirlwinds are going to be able to remain stationary and ignore the -1 that they would normally get from firing at units that they can't see. Not actually ignore it, but counteract it with the bonus from the heavy keyword. Unfortunately for the detachment, a lot of heavy weapons are also buffed by other detachments entirely, so it is difficult to get value from the Anvil Siege Force. There are some combos within the detachment you can use. We talked about how good an improved critical hit ability can be, and Battle Drill Recall is a stratagem that gives you access to that when you remain stationary. Again, it is a little tough to remain stationary, but if you're getting all the benefits from sustained hits and lethal hits, it can be pretty effective. No Threat Too Great is a great offensive buff. It gives you wound rerolls against monsters or vehicles, and has a little bit of synergy with Ultramarines, since Robute Gilliman can duplicate it for free. It being a battle tactic, you can also use Rites of Battle on it from a Space Marine captain, but that is a little bit less effective when you're talking about infantry units that the captain can jump into. Gilliman gives you an aura, so you can use it on your artillery or your other vehicle units. You could even duplicate it, so if you have the 2 CP for it to begin with, you can use it for 2 CP and then use Gilliman to use it somewhere else, and potentially even get it in a third place with a captain just on the ground. That's a real big highlight for the detachment because getting wound rerolls is incredibly effective. There's also a little bit of a sub-theme in the detachment of objective control and objective holding. You can buff your OC value using not one backward step, as long as you remain stationary, but if you use it to steal an objective away from your opponent, that's probably good enough. Rigid Discipline also lets you fall back out of melee on your opponent's turn, as long as you move to an objective, so there is a little bit of a restriction on it, but it gives you kind of the ability to fall back and do stuff normally. You're just falling back not in your own turn. The downside of that is that you have to use it before you get command points in your command phase, so you have to save a command point all the way through your opponent's turn. The Anvil Siege Force has a couple cool things going for it, but generally speaking, they're not really as effective as the Gladius Task Force or as some other detachments that we'll talk about later. It definitely isn't like dead on arrival, but I think you would typically get more value out of other detachments for a similar archetype. Now, the same can't necessarily be said for the next detachment that we're going to talk about, the 1st Company Assault Force. This one is really sad. It is a veteran and Terminator-focused detachment, but doesn't really do anything to buff those units more than other detachments. Playing in a regular Gladius Task Force is almost certainly going to make you more effective than playing in the 1st Company Assault Force, which is sad. There are some interesting combos with units like Stern Guard Veterans. You can use Heroes of the Chapter to give yourself an accuracy buff, which makes it better if you are re-rolling and trying to fish for things like lethal or sustained hits. And just having +1 to hit on a stick for 1 CP is not too bad. It also has a little bit of interesting synergy with Ultramarines, again, because of Robuti Gilliman. If he chooses the benefit with his Primarch of the Ultramarines ability, he can choose to Oath of Moment targets, which, if you kill your first Oath of Moment target that you chose in your command phase, basically re-targets Oath of Moment to the second unit. Because once per game, you can get wound rerolls as well, thanks to the 1st Company Assault Force detachment ability. You can get wound rerolls against both of those enemy units. You wound reroll until you kill the first one, then your Oath of Moment becomes active on the second one, and you'll get wound rerolls against them as well. So that's kind kind of fun and cool, but it's only a once per game ability, so I don't really think it's quite as effective as playing in another detachment that will more passively buff your damage output. Moving on, we'll talk about the Stormlance Assault Force. This is a detachment focused almost entirely on fast units and melee. It has huge synergies with mounted units, but the downside is that vanilla Space Marines don't actually really have that many mounted units. Basically, it can buff Outriders to be incredibly good, but you don't really have access to other mounted stuff outside of that unit. If you look outside the Space Marine Codex and you start to look at factions like Dark Angels or like Space Wolves that have chapter-specific mounted units, this detachment actually gets much more powerful. So in the context of vanilla Space Marines, it's not that good, but in the hands of a Space Wolf player, it is incredibly effective since all of their synergies will work with Thunderwolf Cavalry. That includes the ability to advance and charge, and even auto-advance 6 inches instead of rolling normally. And to be fair, the advancing and charging is not specific to mounted units. That one everybody gets. So you can take things like Assault Intercessors with jump packs, for example, and get really long threat ranges out of them. Unfortunately, it doesn't really buff their damage output when they get to melee. Their one melee damage improving ability, a Shock Assault, which can give your units lance, only works on mounted units. So if you're not taking mounted units, you're able to get into melee very quickly, but you're not really able to do much when you get there. You would probably be better off playing the same units in Gladius Task Force because you get Assault Doctrine and you get Honor the Chapter, which is a strictly better buff that can be used on anybody rather than the Shock Assault from the Stormlance detachment. That said, there are some interesting combos with the detachment that you can't find in Gladius Task Force. The Hunter's Instinct enhancement allows you to strategic reserve or rapid ingress onto the table in the very first battle round. That can potentially allow you to alpha strike your opponent and pin them into their deployment zone from an early turn. Ride Hard, Ride Fast actually is a huge buff for not only mounted units, but also flying vehicles. This works on things like aircraft, so Storm Raven gunships and even Thunderhawks can get the benefit. And a -1 to hit and wound Storm Raven gunship that's also -1 damage and potentially has Armor of Contempt is just really hard to kill, which is kind of a funny place for the detachment to be. Blitzing Fusillade is also used alongside a lot of units that already have assault weapons. So units like the Inceptors that we talked about earlier can also get sustained hits as a little bit of a bonus, which is good for their plasma weapons, which don't have sustained hits baked in. You'll often see a couple of units that have powerful assault weapons included in Stormlance Task Force lists just to use this stratagem on them. If I move on to the future and break down individual chapters, we'll probably be talking about this detachment a lot more as we talk about other chapters that have more mounted units available to them. But for vanilla Space Marines, it's probably better to look elsewhere, even though there are some cool and unique combos inside the Stormlance Assault Force. That said, the next Assault Force that we're going to talk about is the Firestorm Assault Force, and that one is very good. Firestorm Assault Force is all about buffs to your mobility, transports, and, most importantly, short-range guns. You want to get up and close and personal and shoot your opponent directly in the face with a melt-a-gun? This is the detachment for you. It has possibly the most insane damage output of any detachment in the faction, but it is lacking a little bit in flexibility, and it only does so at very short range, so your opponent is likely to come back and kill you. That said, you can do so much damage at that short range that it's often worth playing with anyway, because they're just going to be dead. The detachment gives every single weapon in the army assault, so you're able to advance and shoot permanently, as well as a strength bonus when you're within 12 inches. Now, this is not limited to weapons that are already assault, so it is strictly better than the benefit that Anvil Siege Force gives to heavy weapons. And it has enormous synergy with flamers and melta weapons that are typically already going to be within that 12-inch range band when you're shooting it. For this reason, it has specific synergy with salamanders, probably very appropriately, because Vulcan Heston gives you rerolls on your torrent and melta weapons. So not only are you getting a strength buff and a threat range increase to these styles of weapons, but you're also probably getting a wound reroll from Vulcan and potentially +1 to wound from the stratagem Crucible of Battle, which is just a +1 to wound on a stick as long as your unit is within 6 inches of your opponent's unit, which you can also use when you're in melee. Already, I think the strategy of this detachment is pretty clear. You want to take a bunch of really high power short range weapons, run up close to your opponent, and then use them to kill them. But there are some cool combos that you can use to do so. The big one is Immolation Protocols with any flamer that rerolls. This allows you to fish with a high volume flamer attack to get a critical wounds, those being wound rolls rolls of 6 that can then turn into devastating damage, which is unsavable. Given that most flamers are AP 0, turning those into devastating damage is a huge damage improvement. This is especially good on big units with lots of flamers. Aggressors with their twin Flamestorm gauntlets have rerolls baked in, so they're a perfect place for this combo. But you can also use large units of things like Vanguard veterans with hand flamers, or even Infernus Marines with their own Pyre blasters. Those will specifically need Vulcan to get their rerolls to ensure that you get lots of devastating damage. You also have lots of good synergies with vehicles, especially transports. You have the ability to jump out and shoot reactively at an opponent that shot your transport with Burning Vengeance. Again, this is pretty good with flamer weapons that don't necessarily need you to combo any accuracy buffs when shooting back, and makes it very difficult for your opponent to play in a similar style, because if they move up close to you to shoot at you, you'll just shoot back at them and kill them during their own turn, which is sad. You can also use Rapid Embarkation to jump back into transports at the end of a fight phase. That specifically requires you not to have disembarked in the same turn, so you can't jump out of a transport, shoot, and then jump back in. But you can if you have effects like Fire Support from the Razorback, for example. Get a unit out, shoot with it, and then in your opponent's turn, if they haven't killed either of those units, jump back in and get Fire Support again for the future turn. You can also start a unit outside a transport, potentially in cover or behind a ruin, move it out aggressively, shoot with it, and then embark into a transport because it has not disembarked in that turn. So that's another way you can use it. And it has specific synergy with Vulcan, because Vulcan can stand somewhere on the table, move out, give his buff to your Flamers and Meltas, and then use Rapid Embarkation to hide in a transport so he can do it again. Again, the Firestorm Assault Force is very straightforward. It has no way to fall back and do anything normally, so once you get engaged in melee, you're kind of stuck, but the goal is to not get engaged in melee because you've killed everyone. It's very on the nose, it's very aggressive, and it does tons of damage, and for those reasons, it's one of my favorite detachments. That said, it's not quite as technical and not quite as flexible as some other detachments like Gladius Task Force that we've talked about previously. Now, basically the exact opposite of the Firestorm Assault Force is the Vanguard Spearhead. This is a mobility and stealth focused detachment, which you'd think would mean that it's good with Phobos units and forward operators, but not quite. It's basically entirely dependent on heavy infantry. Units like aggressors or centurions have tons of synergies with this detachment. A big reason for that is guerrilla tactics, a stratagem that allows you to put your infantry into strategic reserve at the end of your opponent's turn. This is a mobility increase for those big, huge, heavy infantry units that don't tend to be very fast. And it also gives the detachment special synergy with Ultramarines because Uriel Ventress can give infantry units deep strike, which allows you to deep strike those units instead of using the normal strategic reserve rule, which is much more flexible, allows you to jump in on the bottom of the first battle round, which you normally can't do. Since you started on the table, you can put them into reserve and then deep strike them back in your first reinforcement step, which is cool. And you can do it anywhere outside 9 inches of enemies rather than 6 inches off a table edge. As an aside, I should mention that this is as a result of the deep strike and strategic reserve rules from the rules commentary packets, which allow you, if you have both deep strike and are in strategic reserve, to arrive using deep strike rather than strategic reserve. The detachment also has some synergies with long-ranged guns. When you are far away from your opponent, it gives you a defensive buff. You get permanent cover and stealth, which also affects vehicles. So long-range vehicles like the Gladiators and Ballistus Dreadnoughts we talked about previously are very good in this detachment. You can also use Strike from the Shadows on your infantry to improve their ballistic skill and armor penetration, which again is good for units like Centurions that have long-ranged, big, high-impact anti-tank weapons. As a bit of an aside, there's a detachment like this in basically every edition of 40k, and they always are better on Centurions than they are on the sneakier units. It's a kind of a flavor fail. Centurions are not exactly the stealthiest guys in the Space Marine arsenal, but that's how they end up being, and it does make those units very good in this detachment, more so than they are in most of the other detachments. Another way that it improves heavy infantry with attached characters, so things like Terminators or Aggressors, is by using Blade Driven Deep, which allows that unit to infiltrate up in the center of the table and get close to the opponent when they would normally have to foot slog all the way there. You can also include several fire and fade effects with units like Phobos Lieutenants who can protect themselves with a Ghostweave Cloak, or using the Execute and Redeploy enhancement, which lets you move after shooting and gives you some good value out of units like Incursors that can move up, apply a hit buff to your army, and then use Execute and Redeploy to run away back to safety to then do it again in the future. Armies out of Vanguard Spearheads tend to be very infantry focused for all all reasons that I talked about previously, but also can include a couple of heavy vehicles to get those defensive benefits that the detachment ability gives them. And with that, let's move on to what is probably the strongest and at least most mathematically powerful detachment in the Codex, the Ironstorm Spearhead. This is a vehicle-focused detachment, but does have some bonuses for other unit types. Because its detachment ability, Armored Wrath, affects everything, it actually gives you a nice benefit if you have lots of small units in your army. It gives each of those units a single reroll on hit, wound, or damage every time they attack. So if you have several units in your army, you're going to be maximizing the number of hit rerolls that you get. This is an incredibly powerful detachment ability. If you assume that you're attacking with, let's say, 8 units every shooting phase, it gets you 8 command points worth of rerolls, which is a lot of value. And you also get it in your opponent's turn. If you're fighting in the fight phase or overwatching, because this ability works anytime you attack, you get to use it outside your normal shooting phase as well. The vehicles in the detachment are buffed by the incredible enhancements that Ironstorm Spearhead gives you access to. Most Ironstorm Spearhead builds will include the trifecta of Target Augury Web, which grants lethal hits to vehicles within 6 inches, an Adept of the Omnissiah, which allows you to change the damage characteristic of enemy attacks to 0 once per battle round if you fail a saving throw on a vehicle. So basically you can blank one attack that the vehicle would normally suffer. And the Master of Machine War, which allows your vehicles to advance, fall back, and still shoot. These basically buff you in every aspect. You have a threat range increase, at least for your ranged attacks, with the Master of Machine War. You have a damage increase with Target Augury Web, and you have a defensive increase with Adept of the Omnissiah. It does require you to take 3 Tech Marines in your list, or at least 2 Tech Marines. So you take 2 of the Tech Marine specific enhancements, and then 1 other character who can stand near your vehicles. But if you do so, your army is incredibly effective. Now, you can also combo out that Target Augury Web with another improved critical hit effect. Mercy's Weakness for 1 CP gives you sustained 1 if you're targeting a damaged enemy unit, that being a unit that has either lost models if it's a multi-model unit, or lost wounds if it's a single model unit. And if your vehicle improves your critical hits to 5-ups. So now normally this would mean that you sustained on a 5-up, but if you're within range of that Target Augury Web, you are also getting lethal hits, so automatic wounds, on that 5-up on top of that. This can give it incredible synergy with high volume attacks, so units like Repulsor Executioners or Gladiator Reapers that shoot a bunch of times with their anti-infantry shooting can get a lot of automatic wounds from those lethal hits. When firing their higher impact weapons, like the Laser Destroyer on the Repulsor Executioner, you can also use the floating reroll that you get from the detachment ability. So there is multiple layers of synergy with these styles of vehicles and the detachment. You can also stack multiple defensive benefits. You can use units like Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Stormraven gunships that have damage reduction abilities baked in and are already hard to take down, and sit them next to the Tech Marine with the Adept of the Omnissiah, allowing them to ignore 1 high impact attack each battle round. If your opponent shoots you with a big Laser Destroyer and gets a wound through, you can blank that one and then use their baked in -1 damage to get around a lot of other smaller impact shooting. It won't reduce damage down to 0, except for the Adept of the Omnissiah one, that one will. It will make it so that lots of 2 or 3 damage shots have a tough time getting through your exterior, and that can present a very difficult defensive profile for enemies to deal with, which lets you trundle up the table and push them out of the objectives. This detachment's so flexible, there are a lot of potential builds with it. You can play a defensive-oriented skew, you can also play more offensive-oriented, or just take a bunch of vehicles that you think are cool and use your floating rerolls to buff them. The big thing to keep in mind with the list is that most of your enhancements are within a very tight aura, so you kind of have to protect your little triumvirate of Tech Marines or characters in the center of the table and try to keep them alive as long as possible. Oftentimes they'll get killed before the end of the game because they're going to be somewhere close to your opponent's army, but usually you'll have gotten enough value from them until that point to actually be able to win. Ironstorm Spearhead, maybe tied with Firestorm, is basically the most straightforward detachment in the Codex. It doesn't have too many complex combos like we've talked about with some of the other detachments. It's mostly just using using its hit rerolls and automatic wounds to do a bunch of damage to your opponent, and putting those on pretty high resilience vehicles. While it's not as tactically flexible as Gladius Task Force, it's another solid starting point for the army, because all you have to do is take lots of units and lots of vehicles, and usually you're doing pretty well. And with that, that is the entire Space Marine Codex. Space Marines are an incredibly rewarding army, both to collect and play. The massive selection of units and unit archetypes supports a wide variety of playstyles, and the flexibility of the detachments and the different styles of detachments allow you to construct your Space Marine army in basically any way that you want. They not only are a good starting place if you are a new player to the game, but they also have the depth to give you continuous experience and lots of additional ways to play them as you evolve as a player. So let me know down in the comment section what chapter your Space Marine army hails from and what style of Space Marine army you want to play. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.